The worst part about having your heart broken on your 21st birthday isn't the pain itself. It's the way everyone around the table keeps eating cake like nothing happened. Like the words that just shattered your world into 1,000 pieces are somehow less important than discussing whether the frosting is store-bought or homemade. I'm Isla Ford, and I thought I knew who I was until 10 minutes ago. Now I'm sitting in my adoptive parents' pristine dining room in suburban Cleveland, staring at the flickering candles on my birthday cake, wondering how a day that started with such promise could end with me questioning everything I've ever believed about myself, my family, and my place in this world. But let me back up. Let me tell you how I got here, to this moment where my entire life feels like it's built on quicksand. 3 weeks ago, I was just another college senior at Ohio State, majoring in social work, with dreams of helping kids in the foster system. Ironic, right? The adopted kid wanting to save other abandoned children. My adoptive parents, Margaret and Harold Pemberton, always seemed proud of this choice. They'd tell their friends at dinner parties how their charity case had grown up to want to help others just like her. Charity case. That's what Margaret called me when she thought I couldn't hear. Never with malice, at least I didn't think so then. More like I was a successful project, a testament to their goodness. The Pembertons adopted me when I was 3 years old from a children's home in Toledo. I have fragments of memories from before, a woman with dark hair singing lullabies, the smell of cinnamon in a small kitchen, warm hands braiding my hair. But Margaret always dismissed these as fantasy whenever I brought them up. Children create false memories, she'd say with that tight smile of hers. It's better to focus on your real family now. Real family. That phrase has haunted me for 18 years. I grew up in their beautiful colonial house on Maple Street, where everything was perfectly coordinated, from the matching throw pillows to the family photos where I always looked slightly out of place among their blonde, blue-eyed relatives. I learned to play piano because Margaret insisted, got good grades because Harold expected nothing less, and developed a passion for helping others because somewhere deep inside, I understood what it felt like to need help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My childhood wasn't unhappy, exactly. The Pembertons provided for me, sent me to good schools, made sure I had opportunities. But there was always this underlying current of transaction. Like I was supposed to be grateful, and that gratitude was payment for their kindness. They never let me forget that they chose me, rescued me, gave me a better life than I would have had otherwise. Some children aren't so fortunate, Margaret would say whenever I complained about anything. Remember where you came from. But here's the thing. I didn't remember where I came from. And every time I asked, they'd get this look. Harold would clear his throat and change the subject. Margaret would get busy with some household task. It was like my past was a door they'd sealed shut, and I wasn't allowed to have the key. 3 weeks ago, that started to change. I was cleaning out the basement, helping Margaret prepare for their annual charity auction, another one of her projects where she could showcase their generosity, when I knocked over a box of old documents. Papers scattered everywhere, and as I gathered them up, one caught my eye. It was a letter, yellowed with age, addressed to Margaret and Harold Pemberton. The return address made my breath catch. St. Catherine's Children's Home, Toledo, Ohio. But it wasn't from 18 years ago, like it should have been. It was dated just 5 years ago. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The letter was brief, professional, but the words hit me like a physical blow. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton, we understand your desire to maintain privacy regarding Isla's placement, but we feel obligated to inform you that her maternal grandmother, Rosa Martinez, has been searching for her granddaughter for several years.
Miss Martinez has provided substantial documentation proving her relationship to the child and has expressed her desire to make contact if possible. We respect your legal rights as adopted parents, but wanted to ensure you were aware of this ongoing situation. I read it 3 times before the words sunk in. My maternal grandmother, Rosa Martinez. Someone had been looking for me. Someone who shared my blood, my history, my story from before the Pembertons. And they knew. They'd known for 5 years and never said a word. I almost confronted them right then, letter in hand, heart pounding with a mixture of rage and hope. But something held me back. Maybe it was 18 years of learning to be grateful, of not rocking the boat, of being the good adopted daughter who didn't ask too many questions. Or maybe it was the fear that if I pushed too hard, I'd lose the only family I'd ever known, imperfect as it was. So I put the letter back, sealed that box, and tried to pretend I'd never seen it. But it was like trying to forget you're on fire. The knowledge burned inside me, making everything feel different. Every family dinner became a performance. Every conversation felt loaded with secrets. Every time Margaret complained about the ungrateful foster kids she volunteered with, I wondered what she really thought about me. 2 weeks passed like that. 2 weeks of watching the people I called Mom and Dad, wondering who they really were underneath their carefully constructed personas. 2 weeks of staring at my reflection, trying to see Rosa Martinez instead of Margaret Pemberton's influence in my features. Then came my 21st birthday. Margaret had planned everything perfectly, as she always did. Harold's sister and her family drove up from Cincinnati. Margaret's book club friends came by for cake. The house was decorated in soft pastels. Margaret's favorite colors, not mine, and everyone kept commenting on how lovely everything looked. I played my part, smiling and thanking everyone for their gifts. A pearl necklace from Margaret and Harold that looked exactly like something Margaret would wear. A gift card to a bookstore I never shopped at. Practical things from practical people who thought they knew what I needed. But as the evening wore on, I felt this growing restlessness, like I was watching my life from outside my body, seeing this young woman who looked like me, going through the motions of celebrating another year of existence, while inside she was screaming to know who she really was. That's when Harold's sister, Aunt Patricia, made what she probably thought was an innocent comment. She was looking through the family photo albums Margaret always brought out at gatherings, comparing baby pictures, pointing out family resemblances. "It's so funny," Patricia said, her voice carrying that slight slur that indicated she'd enjoyed too many glasses of wine, "how Isla doesn't look like anyone in the family. I mean, we all have the fair skin and light eyes, and she's got that beautiful olive complexion and those dark features. Sometimes I forget she's not blood-related." The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people enjoying each other's company, but the awkward silence that falls when someone says what everyone's thinking, but no one wants to acknowledge it. Margaret's jaw tightened. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, that familiar mixture of embarrassment and anger that came whenever someone pointed out how different I looked, how I didn't quite belong. "Patricia," Margaret said sharply, "that's enough." But Patricia was on a roll now, emboldened with wine and maybe years of holding back these thoughts. "Oh, come on, Margaret. It's not like it's a secret, and it's not a bad thing. I was lucky you and Harold took her in. God knows what else would have happened to her otherwise." That's when I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was turning 21, officially becoming an adult. Maybe it was those 2 weeks of carrying the weight of that hidden letter. Or maybe it was just finally reaching my breaking point after years of being reminded that I was different, that I was rescued, that I should be grateful for scraps of belonging. "What do you mean by that?" I asked quietly. Patricia looked surprised that I'd spoken up. In 18 years, I'd never challenged these conversations. I had always just absorbed them, internalized them, carried the shame like it was mine to bear.
"Well," she stammered, glancing at Margaret and Harold for support that didn't come.
I just meant that you have a good life here, a stable home, parents who love you. But what did you mean about what would have happened to me otherwise? The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's knuckles were white where she gripped her coffee cup. Harold was studying his hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. Isla, Margaret said finally, her voice carefully controlled, this isn't the time or place for this discussion. When is the time? I asked, and I could hear my voice getting stronger, more determined. I'm 21 years old. I think I have the right to know about my own life. That's when Harold cleared his throat and said the words that would change everything. Your birth family made their choices, Isla. There's no point in dwelling on it. What choices? Margaret and Harold exchanged a look that I'd seen countless times over the years, but never understood until now. It was the look of people who shared a secret, who had agreed on a story, and were checking to make sure they were still telling the same version. Your real family abandoned you for a reason, Margaret said finally, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. Some people aren't meant to be parents. Some people can't handle responsibility. You should be grateful that Harold and I were willing to give you the opportunities they couldn't. The words hit me like a slap. Not because they were cruel, though they were, but because of how easily she said them. Like she'd been thinking them for years, waiting for the right moment to let me know exactly where I stood in her estimation. But it was the word real that cut deepest. My real family. As if the Pembertons were some kind of consolation prize, as if the people who raised me were somehow less authentic than the ones who'd given me away. Except, I knew now that it wasn't true. At least, not all of it. I thought about Rosa Martinez, my maternal grandmother, who had been searching for me. I thought about the letter hidden in the basement, about 5 years of missed opportunities for connection, for answers, for the truth about who I was and where I came from. And I realized that Margaret was right about one thing. Some people do abandon children. But sometimes the people doing the abandoning aren't who you think they are. You're right, I said quietly, setting down my fork and looking around the table at all these people who were supposed to care about me. Some families do abandon their children, but sometimes it's not the biological family that does the abandoning. Margaret's face went pale. Harold started to speak, but I held up my hand. I know about Rosa Martinez. I know someone has been looking for me. I know you've been hiding letters, hiding the truth, hiding pieces of my identity from me for years. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Harold's sister gathered her children and quickly made excuses about needing to get home. Margaret's book club friends suddenly remembered other obligations. Within 20 minutes, the party was over. The guests were gone, and I was alone with the two people who had shaped my entire understanding of myself, love, and family. And I realized that my 21st birthday wasn't just marking another year of life, but marking the end of the life I thought I knew, and the beginning of something different. Something that might finally lead me to the truth about who I really am. But first, I had to figure out if I had the courage to go looking for it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The morning after my birthday, I woke up in a house that felt like a stranger's home. Everything looked the same: the cream-colored walls, the perfectly arranged furniture, the family photos that suddenly seemed like elaborate props. But I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes. Like someone had adjusted the lens of my life, and now everything was sharper, more defined, and infinitely more painful. Margaret was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, moving through her morning routine with mechanical precision. Coffee brewing, newspaper folded just so, everything in its designated place. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, but her voice sounded forced,
like she was trying to pretend last night never happened. I made your favorite pancakes. They weren't my favorite. They were hers. But I'd learned long ago not to correct these small misunderstandings about who I was. Now, though, each one felt like another piece of evidence that the people who raised me had never really known me at all. "We need to talk," I said, sitting down at the kitchen island where I'd eaten breakfast for 18 years. Margaret's shoulders tensed. She kept her back to me, focused on flipping pancakes that neither of us would eat. "About what happened last night? Patricia had too much wine. People say things they don't mean when—" "I'm not talking about Patricia. I'm talking about Rosa Martinez. I'm talking about the letters you've been hiding. I'm talking about the fact that my grandmother has been looking for me and you never told me." The spatula clattered against the pan. Margaret's hands were shaking now, and she gripped the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "How did you—" She stopped, closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something had hardened in her expression. "You were snooping through our private papers. I was helping you organize for the charity auction, just like you asked. The box fell over. I wasn't snooping, I was cleaning up the mess." I paused, watching her face. "But even if I was, don't you think I have the right to know about my own family?" "We are your family." The words came out sharp, defensive. "Harold and I are the ones who fed you, clothed you, sent you to school, stayed up with you when you were sick. We're the ones who lied to me." The interruption surprised both of us. I'd never spoken to Margaret like this before, never challenged her narrative of gratitude and obligation. "For 5 years, you've known that someone who shares my blood has been looking for me. Someone who might be able to tell me where I come from, who I am, why I was placed for adoption. And you decided that I didn't deserve to know?" Margaret turned around then, her face flushed with anger, and something that looked almost like panic. "You don't understand how complicated these situations are, Isla. That woman, she's not some fairy tale grandmother waiting to welcome you with open arms. She's part of a system that failed you once already." "How do you know that? Have you met her? Have you talked to her? Or are you just assuming the worst because it's convenient for you?" "We protected you." The words exploded out of her, louder than I'd ever heard Margaret speak. "We gave you stability, security, a chance at a real future. Do you know what your life would have been like if we hadn't intervened?" "No, I don't know. And neither do you, because you never gave me the chance to find out." Harold appeared in the doorway then, drawn by the sound of raised voices. He looked exhausted, older than his 58 years, like the weight of secrets had been aging him prematurely. "What's going on?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "Your daughter," Margaret said, her voice dripping with frustration, "has decided that we're the villains in her little adoption story." "I'm not looking for villains," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "I'm looking for the truth." Harold sank into a chair at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples. "Isla, honey, sometimes the truth isn't as simple as people want it to be." "Then explain it to me. Help me understand." I moved to sit across from him, trying to bridge the gap that seemed to be widening between us with every word. "Tell me about Rosa Martinez. Tell me why you decided I shouldn't know she was looking for me." Harold and Margaret exchanged another one of those loaded looks, and I realized that this moment had always been coming. Maybe not today, maybe not like this, but eventually the truth would have forced its way to the surface. "She contacted the agency when you were 16, Harold said finally. "Said she'd been searching for you since you were placed, but it had taken her years to track down which agency handled your case." 16? The number hit me like a physical blow. I was 16 and you didn't tell me? "You were a child," Margaret interjected. "You had college applications to worry about, your whole future ahead of you. We weren't going to let some stranger disrupt your life just because she claimed to be related to you." "She didn't claim to be related to me. She proved it, didn't she? The letter mentioned documentation. She had proof." Harold nodded reluctantly. "Birth certificates, hospital records, photos. The agency verified her identity." "What else?" I pressed.
What else did they tell them?
Another pause, another exchanged glance. Margaret crossed her arms over her chest, like she was protecting herself from what she was about to reveal. She said your mother, her daughter, died in a car accident when you were 2, Harold said quietly. She said she'd been trying to get custody of you, but there were complications. What kind of complications? Financial, legal. She was working 2 jobs, trying to get stable housing, dealing with the bureaucracy of the system. Harold's voice was getting quieter, like he was reluctant to give me these details. By the time she had everything in order, you'd already been placed with us. The kitchen went silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock. I stared at Harold, trying to process what he'd just told me. My mother was dead, had been dead for 19 years. But my grandmother, Rosa Martinez, she hadn't abandoned me. She'd fought for me. She'd been looking for me for 14 years, I said slowly. 14 years of not knowing where I was, not knowing if I was safe or happy or even alive. Isla, Margaret started. And when she finally found me, you decided I didn't need to know? I could feel tears building behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet, not in front of them. You decided that a woman who spent 14 years searching for her granddaughter wasn't worth my time. We decided that a young woman who had a stable home and a bright future didn't need to be confused by people from a past she couldn't even remember, Margaret said, her voice rising again. We decided that your well-being was more important than some stranger's guilt. Guilt? The word came out sharper than I intended. You think she was looking for me because of guilt? I think she was looking for you because she failed your mother, and she wanted a second chance to feel better about herself. And I wasn't going to let her use you to absolve herself of whatever mistake she made 20 years ago. The accusation hung in the air like poison. I stared at Margaret, at this woman who had raised me, fed me, taught me right from wrong, and I realized that I didn't recognize her at all. When had she become so cynical? When had she started assuming the worst about people instead of the best? Or had she always been this way, and I'd just been too grateful to notice? You don't know anything about her, I said finally. You never talked to her. You never gave her a chance to explain her side of the story. You just decided that your version of my life was the only one that mattered. Because we love you, Harold said desperately. Because we wanted to protect you from getting hurt. No, I said, standing up from the table. You wanted to protect yourselves. You are afraid that if I knew the truth, I might choose her over you. You are afraid that if I had other options, I might not be as grateful for the life you gave me. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret turned back to the stove, her shoulders rigid with anger and hurt. Harold stared at his hands like they might contain answers to questions he didn't want to ask. And I stood there in the kitchen where I'd grown up, surrounded by the familiar smells of coffee and pancakes and the underlying scent of Margaret's vanilla candles, and felt like I was saying goodbye to my childhood. I need her contact information, I said quietly. Absolutely not, Margaret replied without turning around. I'm 21 years old. I'm an adult. You can't keep this information from me anymore. We don't have her contact information, Harold said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. The agency handled all the communication. Then I'll contact the agency. Isla, please, Harold reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Don't do this. Don't throw away everything we built together for some fantasy about a grandmother who might not be who you think she is. I'm not throwing anything away, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I wondered if they were true. I'm trying to find the missing pieces of myself. I'm trying to understand where I come from,
who I am beyond what you've told me I should be. You know who you are, Margaret said, finally turning to face me. You're our daughter. You're Isla Ford. You're a college senior with excellent grades and a bright future ahead of you. Why isn't that enough? The question hit me harder than I expected, because part of me had been asking myself the same thing. Why wasn't it enough to have been loved, even imperfectly? Why wasn't it enough to have had opportunities, education, stability? Why did I need more? But standing there, looking at Margaret's desperate face and Harold's defeated posture, I realized that it wasn't about needing more. It was about needing truth, about needing the full picture of who I was, not just the version that made other people comfortable. It's enough for you, I said finally, but it's not enough for me. Not anymore. I left them in the kitchen and went upstairs to pack a bag. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by all those carefully constructed lies, pretending that nothing had changed. As I threw clothes into my overnight bag, I thought about Rosa Martinez. I tried to imagine her face, her voice, her hands that might look like mine. I wondered what she'd been doing for the past 5 years since that letter was sent. Had she given up looking? Had she assumed I didn't want to be found? Or was she still out there somewhere, still hoping that someday her granddaughter would come home? I was about to find out.
I drove aimlessly through Cleveland for 2 hours before I finally admitted to myself that I had no idea what I was doing. My overnight bag sat in the passenger seat of my beat-up Honda Civic, the car Harold had helped me buy for my 18th birthday, back when our relationship wasn't built on lies and withheld truths. And I kept glancing at it like it might contain answers instead of just hastily packed clothes and toiletries. The city looked different somehow. The familiar streets and landmarks that had mapped out my entire world suddenly felt foreign, like I was seeing them through the eyes of someone else, someone who didn't belong here, someone who was finally ready to admit that maybe she'd never belonged here in the first place. I pulled into the parking lot of a diner on the east side of town, Mickey's Place, one of those establishments that had probably looked exactly the same since 1975. The kind of place Margaret would never set foot in, with its cracked vinyl booths and coffee that could strip paint. But right now, it felt more honest than anywhere else I could think of. The waitress was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and tired eyes that suggested she'd seen every kind of human drama imaginable. She poured my coffee without being asked and set down a laminated menu that had clearly survived decades of use. "You look like you're running from something, honey," she said, not unkindly. "More like running towards something," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. She nodded, like that made perfect sense. Sometimes it's the same thing. I sat there for an hour, nursing my coffee and trying to figure out my next move. I had my laptop, my phone, and about $300 in my checking account. I also had something I'd never possessed before, the absolute certainty that I couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine. The first step, I decided, was finding St. Catherine's Children's Home in Toledo. If they'd been the intermediary between Rosa Martinez and the Pembertons, they might still have records, contact information, something that could help me bridge the gap between my past and my present. I opened my laptop and started searching. St. Catherine's had a website, but it was sparse, just basic information about their services and a generic contact form. No staff directory, no detailed history, nothing that suggested they'd be eager to help an adult adoptee track down information from old cases. But I found something else. An article in the Toledo Blade from 3 years ago about changes in Ohio's adoption laws, making it easier for adult adoptees to access their original birth certificates and other records. The article mentioned several adoption advocacy groups, support networks for people in situations exactly like mine. One name stood out: Sarah Chen, Executive Director of Ohio Adoptee Rights Coalition.
The article quoted her extensively about the importance of giving adopted individuals access to their own histories. Every person has the right to know their own story, she'd said. Denying someone their basic identity information is a form of emotional violence that can last a lifetime. Emotional violence. The phrase hit me like a lightning bolt, not because it felt dramatic, but because it felt accurate. All those years of being told I should be grateful, that my questions about my past were somehow disloyal or ungrateful, it had been a systematic erasure of part of who I was. I found the coalition's website and spent the next hour reading testimonials from other adoptees. Story after story of people who'd been told their birth families didn't want them, only to discover years later that their families had been searching frantically. Stories of adoptive parents who had intercepted letters, blocked contact, constructed elaborate lies to keep their children from learning uncomfortable truths. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful or disloyal for wanting to know where I came from. By the time I finished reading, my coffee was cold and the diner was filling up with the lunch crowd. I had a plan, or at least the beginning of one. But first, I needed to make a call I'd been avoiding. My best friend Jessica answered on the second ring. We'd been roommates for 3 years at OSU, and she was one of the few people who understood that my relationship with my adoptive parents was complicated. Isla, where are you? I've been texting you all morning. I'm in Cleveland at a diner. Jess, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay. Her voice was cautious now. What's going on? Do you think I'm wrong for wanting to find my birth family?
The pause that followed was longer than I expected. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. I think you've been asking that question for as long as I've known you. And I think the fact that you're finally ready to do something about it means you already know the answer. The Pembertons think I'm being selfish. They think I'm throwing away everything they've given me. The Pembertons are scared, Jessica said bluntly. They're scared that if you find your birth family, you'll realize that love doesn't have to come with conditions and guilt trips attached to it. Her words hit me harder than I expected. You really think that's what they're afraid of? Isla, I've watched you apologize for existing for 3 years. I've seen you twist yourself into knots trying to be the perfect, grateful adopted daughter. I've watched you choose your major, your career path, even your boyfriend based on what you thought would make them proud, instead of what actually made you happy. I thought about David, my ex-boyfriend who'd lasted exactly 6 months, because he reminded Margaret of her nephew, bland, predictable, safe. I'd broken up with him not because he was a bad person, but because dating him felt like wearing a costume that didn't fit. So what do? I asked. You do what you should have done years ago. You stop asking permission to find out who you are. After I hung up with Jessica, I sat in that diner booth for another hour, watching people come and go, listening to conversations about mundane things like work schedules and grocery lists and weekend plans. Normal people living normal lives, not wrestling with questions about identity and belonging and whether wanting to know your own story made you a bad person. Finally, I opened my laptop again and found the phone number for the Ohio Adoptee Rights Coalition. Sarah Chen answered on the third ring. Her voice was warm but professional, and she listened without interrupting as I explained my situation. When I finished, there was a brief pause before she spoke. Isla, what you're describing is unfortunately common. Many adoptive parents mean well, but they let their own fears and insecurities override what's actually best for the child they've adopted. She paused. Can you tell me more about what you know regarding your grandmother's attempts to make contact? I told her about the letter, about the 5-year delay, about Margaret and Harold's refusal to share Rosa Martinez's information. As I talked, I felt something shifting inside me, a sense of validation I'd never experienced before. Sarah didn't tell me I should be grateful. She didn't suggest I was being disloyal or dramatic. She just listened and took notes and treated my desire to know my own history as completely reasonable.
Here's what we can do, she said when I finished. First, you're entitled to request your original birth certificate from the state of Ohio. That will give you your mother's name and other basic information. Second, I can help you contact St. Catherine's directly. As an adult, you have rights they have to respect, regardless of what your adoptive parents prefer. What if my grandmother has given up looking for me? What if she thinks I don't want to be found? Then you'll find out, and you can make an informed decision about what you want to do next. But Isla, based on what you've told me, this woman spent 14 years searching for you. That's not the behavior of someone who gives up easily. We talked for another 20 minutes about next steps, timelines, what I could realistically expect. Sarah gave me the contact information for a social worker at St. Catherine's who specialized in post-adoption services, and she promised to email me a packet of information about Ohio adoption laws and adoptee rights. When I finally hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the careful, conditional hope of someone who'd learned not to ask for too much, but the bright, uncomplicated hope of someone who was finally ready to fight for what she needed. I paid for my coffee and walked back to my car, but before I got in, I pulled out my phone and called Harold. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting. Isla, where are you? Margaret's been worried sick. I'm fine, Harold, but I need you to know that I'm not coming home until you and Margaret are ready to have an honest conversation about my adoption. Sweetheart, we can talk about whatever you want. Just come home. I don't want to talk about it as a favor to me, I said, watching traffic move past on the busy street. I want to talk about it because you finally understand that I have the right to know my own story. I want you to help me find Rosa Martinez, not because I'm forcing you to, but because you believe I deserve to know my grandmother. The silence stretched between us. In the background, I could hear Margaret asking questions, her voice high and anxious. And if we can't do that? Harold asked quietly. Then I'll find her myself, and you'll have to decide whether you want to be part of my life as it actually is, or if you only want the version of me that makes you comfortable. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline. From the intoxicating rush of finally speaking my truth without apologizing for it. I had Rosa Martinez's name. I had resources and allies I didn't know existed 6 hours ago. I had a car, a laptop, and the absolute certainty I was done living someone else's version of my story. For the first time in 21 years, I was ready to find out who Isla Ford really was, and I was ready to do it on my own terms. The drive to Toledo would take about 2 hours. I had just enough time to stop by my apartment, grab some more clothes, and figure out where I'd be staying while I searched for the missing pieces of my life. As I pulled out of the diner parking lot, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked different somehow. Older, more determined, more like someone who belonged to herself instead of someone who belonged to other people's expectations. I looked like someone who was finally going home, even if she didn't know where home was yet.
The social worker at St. Catherine's Children's Home was nothing like what I'd expected. Linda Vasquez was probably in her early 40s, with laugh lines around her eyes and a warm smile that made her cramped office feel less institutional. She'd agreed to meet with me on short notice after Sarah Chen from the coalition had made some calls, and now I sat across from her desk, feeling like I was about to open a door I could never close again. "Before we begin," Linda said, pulling a thick file from her cabinet, "I want you to know that what we're about to discuss might be difficult to hear. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than we hope it will be." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "I understand." "Good." She opened the file, and I caught a glimpse of papers, photographs, official documents spanning years. "Let's start with what you already know, and then I'll fill in the gaps." Over the next hour, Linda reconstructed my early life with the careful precision of someone who'd done this many times before. She told me about my mother, Carmen Martinez, who had been 19 when I was born.
Carmen had been studying nursing at Toledo Community College while working nights at a local hospital to support us both. She'd never married my father, a detail the Pembertons had left out, but according to the records, she'd been managing fine on her own until the accident. Your mother was driving home from work during a snowstorm. Another driver ran a red light. She was killed instantly. The words hit me like physical blows, even though I'd already learned about my mother's death from Harold. But hearing the details made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Carmen Martinez hadn't abandoned me. She'd died trying to get home to me. What happened next? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. You were placed in emergency foster care while the state tried to locate family members. That's when your grandmother Rosa came forward. She pulled out a photograph and handed it across the desk. This was taken during one of her visits with you. The photo nearly stopped my heart. It showed a woman in her 40s with dark hair and kind eyes, holding a toddler who was unmistakably me. But it was our hands that made my breath catch. We had the same long, slender fingers, the same way of holding ourselves. I was looking up at Rosa with complete trust, and she was looking down at me with an expression of pure love. She wanted custody? I whispered. Desperately. But there were complications. Rosa was working 2 minimum-wage jobs to support herself and your grandfather, who had diabetes and couldn't work consistently. She was living in a 1-bedroom apartment, struggling to make ends meet. The state determined that she couldn't provide the stability you needed. I stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this information with Margaret's harsh words about my real family abandoning me. Rosa looked tired in the photo, yes, but not uncaring, not irresponsible, just overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. How long was I in foster care before the Pembertons got involved? She flipped through several pages. 18 months. You were in 3 different foster homes during that period. Rosa visited you every week that she was allowed to, but the caseworker at the time believed that maintaining the connection was confusing for you. 18 months. A year and a half of my life I couldn't remember, bouncing between strangers' homes while my grandmother fought a system designed to keep families apart instead of together. What changed? How did the Pembertons get involved? They'd been on the adoption waiting list for several years. Margaret had fertility issues, and they specifically requested a young child who could grow up thinking of them as the only parents that she'd ever known. Linda's voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the implication. When you became available, you fit their criteria perfectly. And Rosa? She was told that you'd been placed with a family who could give you opportunities she couldn't. She was encouraged to let you have a fresh start and to think about what was best for your future. She pulled out another document. She signed a relinquishment agreement, but she included a letter asking to be contacted if you ever wanted to find her when you became an adult. My hands shook as I reached for the letter. It was written in careful handwriting on lined paper, and I could see tear stains on the ink in several places. To whoever is caring for my granddaughter Isabel Martinez, I want you to know that giving her up is the hardest thing I have ever done. I love this little girl more than my own life, and I'm only agreeing to this because I've been told it is what is best for her future. I know I cannot give her all the things that a family with more money can give her, but I want her to know that she was loved completely from the moment she was born. Her mother, Carmen, loved her. I love her. She comes from people who worked hard and cared about family and tried to do right by each other. If she ever wants to know about where she comes from, please tell her to find Rosa Martinez in Toledo, Ohio. I will be waiting for her for as long as I live. I will never stop hoping that someday I will see my granddaughter again and tell her how much her mother loved her. Please take good care of our Isabel. She is the most precious thing in our world. Rosa Elena Martinez, December 15th, 1996.
I read the letter 3 times before I could speak. When I looked up, Linda was watching me with compassionate eyes. "Isabel," I said finally. "My name was Isabel."
Isabel Carmen Martinez. Yes, named for your great-grandmother and your mother. Isabel Carmen Martinez. The name felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like a song I'd heard in a dream. It certainly felt more authentic than Isla Ford, the name the Pembertons had chosen because it sounded more modern. Did Rosa really keep trying to contact me after the adoption? Linda nodded and pulled out a stack of letters all addressed to St. Catherine's, all requesting information about my well-being or permission to send me messages. The dates spanned years: birthday cards that were never delivered, Christmas presents that were returned to sender, school photos that Rosa had somehow obtained and treasured. The most recent contact was indeed 5 years ago, when she hired a private investigator to help her navigate the legal system. That's when we sent the letter to your adoptive parents. And they never responded? Not directly to us, but we received a letter from their attorney stating that they had no interest in facilitating contact and requesting that we stop forwarding Rosa's communications. I felt a fresh wave of anger at the Pembertons, but it was followed immediately by something else. A deep sadness for all the lost years, all the missed birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that Rosa and I should have shared. Is she... I paused, afraid to ask the question that had been haunting me since I've started this search. Is she still alive? Linda smiled. Very much so. And still in Toledo, actually. She works as a custodian at Mercy Hospital, the same hospital where your mother worked as a nursing assistant. She never moved away because she wanted to make sure you could find her if you ever came looking. 25 years. Rosa had stayed in the same city for 25 years, just in case her granddaughter might someday come home. There's more, Linda said gently. Rosa isn't your only family. Your mother had 2 brothers, and they both have children. You have cousins, aunts, and uncles, a whole extended family that has been wondering about you for years. The information was overwhelming. I'd spent my entire life thinking I was alone in the world except for the Pembertons. And now I was learning about an entire family tree of people who shared my blood, my history, my story. Do they know about me? Rosa told them about you, yes. She has photos of you from when you were small, and she shared stories about Carmen and about the granddaughter she lost. They've all been hoping that someday you'd find your way back to them. I thought about the Pembertons' carefully curated life, their small circle of friends and distant relatives who'd always made me feel like an outsider. I thought about family gatherings where I'd smiled and nodded and felt like I was watching other people's lives through glass. Would they want to meet me? The question came out smaller than I had intended. Isabel, Linda said, using my birth name without hesitation. I think your grandmother would cross the country on foot if she thought it would bring you home. She gave me Rosa's current address, phone number, and work schedule. She also provided contact information for my mother's brothers and their families, along with more photographs spanning the years I'd been gone. Pictures of birthday parties I'd missed, graduations I hadn't attended, holidays where there had always been an empty chair at the table. As I prepared to leave, Linda handed me one final item, a small silver bracelet with a delicate cross charm. This belonged to your mother, she said. Rosa left it here years ago, hoping that someday she'd be able to give it to you herself. I think she'd want you to have it now. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, and it fit perfectly. For the first time since this whole journey had begun, I felt like I was wearing something that actually belonged to me. Walking out of St. Catherine's that afternoon, I carried with me more than just documents and photographs. I carried the weight of 25 years of love that had been waiting for me, of a grandmother who'd never stopped hoping, of a family that had never forgotten the little girl they'd lost. But I also carried something else, the realization that the Pembertons' version of my story had been not just incomplete, but deliberately misleading. They hadn't rescued me from abandonment. They had participated in separating me from people who desperately wanted to keep me. As I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at Rose's address written in Linda's careful handwriting, I knew that everything was about to change. Tomorrow, I would knock on my grandmother's door and step back into a life that had been waiting for me for 25 years. But tonight, I needed to call the Pembertons one more time. Not to ask their permission, and not to apologize for disappointing them. Tonight, I was going to tell them exactly what I'd learned about the family they'd spent my entire childhood teaching me to be grateful I'd escaped from. And then, I was going to tell them goodbye. I sat in my rental car outside 1247 Maple Grove Avenue for 23 minutes before I found the courage to walk to the front door. The house was smaller than I'd imagined, a modest ranch-style home with faded blue siding and a carefully tended garden that spoke of someone who took pride in small things. Wind chimes hung from the front porch, creating a gentle melody in the October breeze, and I could see curtains moving in the front window as if someone had been watching for visitors. My hands shook as I rang the doorbell. I'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times during the sleepless night I'd spent at a Toledo motel, but now that I was actually here, every word I'd planned seemed inadequate. How do you introduce yourself to someone who's been mourning your absence for 25 years? The door opened, and I was looking into eyes that were exactly like mine. Rosa Martinez was smaller than I'd expected, probably no taller than 5'2", with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a faded sweater and jeans, and her face bore the lines of someone who'd worked hard her entire life. But her eyes, those dark brown eyes that I saw in my own reflection every day, were bright and alert and full of an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Isabel? The name came out as barely a whisper. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She stared at me for a long moment, her hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to keep her heart from escaping. Then she began to cry. Not the polite, controlled tears I was used to seeing from Margaret, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal and infinite. "Mija," she whispered, reaching for me with trembling hands. "Oh, mija, you came home." The hug that followed lasted forever and not nearly long enough. She smelled like vanilla and laundry detergent and something else I couldn't identify. Something that felt like safety, like belonging, like the missing piece I'd been searching for my entire life. When we finally separated, Rosa held my face in her hands and studied every feature like she was trying to memorize me all over again. "You look just like your mother," she said, her voice thick with tears, "but you have your grandfather's stubborn chin. He would have been so proud to see you grown up." She led me inside to a living room that was small but immaculately clean, filled with mismatched furniture that somehow managed to feel more welcoming than the Pembertons' perfectly coordinated decor. Every surface held photographs, dozens of them, chronicling the lives of people I was slowly beginning to realize were my family. But it was the shrine in the corner that nearly broke my heart. A small table held a collection of items that told the story of a little girl who'd been lost. My baby shoes, bronzed and polished, a hospital bracelet from when I was born, school pictures that someone, Linda at St. Catherine's, I realized, must have sent over the years, and candles that looked like they'd been lit countless times. "I never stopped believing you'd come back," Rosa said, following my gaze. "Your mother, she came to me in dreams sometimes, and she always told me to keep waiting. She said you'd find your way home when you were ready." We spent the next 3 hours filling in 25 years of gaps. Rosa showed me photo albums spanning decades. My mother as a child, graduation pictures, family gatherings where my absence was a palpable presence. She told me about my uncles, Miguel and Carlos, who were both married with children of their own. She described my grandfather, who had died 7 years ago but had never stopped asking about his granddaughter who had been taken away. "He saved money in a coffee can for years," Rosa said, wiping away fresh tears. "He wanted to hire lawyers, private investigators, anyone who might be able to bring you back to us. but we never had enough, and the system wasn't designed to help people like us. I learned that I had 4 cousins, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging in the age of 15 to 28. I learned that my mother had been studying to become a registered nurse when she died, that she'd planned to take me to Disney World for my 5th birthday, that she'd kept a journal filled with letters to me that Rosa still had. But as wonderful as these revelations were, they came with an undercurrent of pain that I hadn't anticipated. The more Rosa told me about the family that I missed, the more I realized how much the Pembertons have stolen from all of us. Not just from me, but from Rosa, who'd spent 25 years wondering if her granddaughter was safe, happy, or even alive. I wrote to you every year on your birthday, she said, pulling out a shoebox filled with unsent letters. I knew I couldn't mail them, but I thought maybe someday you'd want to read them, to know that someone was thinking about you, praying for you. The letters were heartbreaking in their simple honesty. Rosa had documented my missing years through her own imagination, wondering if I was learning to ride a bike, if I liked school, if I was happy. She'd shared family news, neighborhood gossip, stories about my mother's childhood that she wanted me to know. But it was the more recent letters that nearly destroyed me. The ones where Rosa wrote about her growing fear that she might die before ever seeing me again. The ones where she questioned whether she'd made the right choice in letting me go. The ones where she begged a God she wasn't sure was listening to bring her granddaughter home. Isabel, today you turn 20. I try to imagine what you look like now, if you still have your mother's smile. I wonder if you think about us sometimes, if you know that you have a family who never stopped loving you. Your grandfather's diabetes is getting worse, and I'm scared he'll never get to meet you. Please, Mija, if you're out there, if you ever get these letters, please know that we never wanted to lose you. Please know that not a day goes by that we don't wish things had been different. I was sobbing by the time I finished reading. 20 years of birthdays where Rosa had lit candles and made wishes for a granddaughter who might as well have been on another planet. 20 years of Christmas mornings where she'd set an extra place at the table just in case. I'm so sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry. I never came looking sooner. No, Mija, no. Rosa grabbed my hands, her grip surprisingly strong. You were a child. This was never your responsibility. The adults in your life should have made sure you knew where you came from. As the afternoon wore on, Rosa called my uncles, and within an hour, her small house was filled with people I'd never met, but who welcomed me like I'd been gone on vacation instead of missing for a quarter century. Miguel looked so much like the photos of my mother that it took my breath away. Carlos had my hands, my way of gesturing when I talked. Their wives hugged me like they were their own daughter, and their children, my cousins, stared at me with a mixture of curiosity and excitement.
We always wondered about you, said Elena, my 26-year-old cousin. Abuela Rosa would show us your baby pictures and tell us stories about our cousin who lived far away. When I was little, I used to think you were like a princess in a tower, and someday we'd rescue you. The warmth of their acceptance was overwhelming, but it also highlighted something that had been growing inside me all day. A rage so pure and focused that it scared me. The Pembertons hadn't just deprived me of this family, they'd deprived this family of me. They'd let Rosa spend 25 years wondering if her granddaughter was dead. They'd let my grandfather die without ever meeting me again. They'd stolen decades of relationships, memories, love that could never be recovered. As evening fell and the extended family began to head home, Rosa and I found ourselves alone again. She made coffee and brought out a tin of homemade cookies, and we sat at her small kitchen table while she told me more about my mother. Cotterman was so excited when she found out she was pregnant. She would put headphones on her belly and play music for you. She said she wanted you to know beautiful sounds before you even came into the world. What happened to my father? I asked. It was the one question I'd been afraid to voice all day. Rosa's expression darkened slightly. He was a boy from her nursing class.
When she told him about the pregnancy, he transferred to a different school. Garmin tried to contact him after you were born, but he made it clear he wanted nothing to do with either of you. So there it was. One biological parent who died tragically, another who'd chosen not to be part of my story. It should have been devastating, but somehow, sitting in Rosa's kitchen, surrounded by evidence of how much I'd been loved and missed, it felt less important than I'd expected. "I need to ask you something," I said, setting down my coffee cup, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." Rosa nodded, her expression serious. "If the Pembertons, my adoptive parents, if they had contacted you when I was 16, when you were trying to find me, would you have wanted to meet me then, or were you hoping to take me away from them?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee like it might contain answers. "I just wanted to know you were okay," she said finally. "I wanted to know that the little girl I'd kissed goodbye was growing up healthy and happy and loved. If you had been happy with them, if they had been good parents to you, I would have been grateful. All I ever wanted was to be part of your life in whatever way was possible. And if I hadn't been happy, then I would have fought to bring you home, just like I've been fighting for 25 years. That night, I called the Pembertons from my motel room. Harold answered, and I could hear the relief in his voice when he realized it was me. "Isla, thank God, we've been worried sick. Where are you?" "I'm in Toledo. I'm with Rosa Martinez. I'm with my grandmother." The silence that followed was loaded with 25 years of carefully constructed lies finally coming apart. "I know everything now, Harold. I know that Rosa never abandoned me. I know that she spent 18 months fighting to keep me. I know that she's been looking for me since the day I was taken from her. I know that you and Margaret have been lying to me my entire life. Isla, sweetheart, you don't understand how complicated— No! You don't understand how simple it actually is. You stole me from a family that loved me because you decided you could give me a better life. But you didn't just steal me, Harold. You stole 25 years of my grandmother's life. You let her wonder if I was dead. You let my grandfather die without ever meeting me again. We did what we thought was best. You did what was best for you," I said, and I could hear my own voice getting stronger, more certain. "You wanted a baby who would be grateful, who would never question your version of her story. You wanted a daughter who would make you feel good about yourselves for being so generous. That's not true, Isla. We love you. We've always loved you. Then prove it. Come to Toledo, meet Rosa, look her in the eye, and tell her why you thought it was okay to let her spend 25 years grieving for a granddaughter who was still alive." I hung up before he could respond, but I wasn't done. Tomorrow, I would call Margaret. I would tell her exactly what I thought of her comments about my real family abandoning me. I would make sure she understood that every cruel word, every guilt trip, every attempt to make me grateful for scraps of belonging had been based on lies. But tonight, I sat in that motel room and read every single letter Rosa had written to me over the past 25 years. I read about a love so persistent and unconditional that it had survived decades of separation, uncertainty, and heartbreak. And I began to understand that the real testing wasn't over yet. Because now I had to decide whether the people who'd raised me deserved any place in the life I was finally ready to claim as my own.
Margaret's voice on the phone the next morning was different from any tone I'd ever heard from her before. Not the controlled politeness she used with strangers or the forced warmth she reserved for family gatherings, but something raw and desperate that made her sound like a completely different person. "Isla, please, you have to come home. You have to let us explain." I was sitting in Rosa's kitchen, watching my grandmother prepare breakfast with the same care and attention she'd probably shown to every meal for the past 60 years.
She moved with quiet efficiency, occasionally glancing at me with a mixture of joy and disbelief, as if she was afraid I might disappear if she looked away too long. "There's nothing to explain, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice low so Rosa wouldn't be distracted by the conversation. "I know everything now." "You know one side of the story. You know what that woman has told you, but you don't know the whole truth." Something in Margaret's voice, the way she said "that woman," with such disdain, attributed a protective instinct I didn't know I possessed. Rosa had spent the previous evening showing me photo albums, sharing stories about my mother, and trying to fill in 25 years of gaps with the patience of someone who'd been waiting a lifetime for this conversation. The idea that Margaret would dismiss her so callously made my anger crystallize into something sharper and more focused. "Her name is Rosa," I said. "She's my grandmother, and I've spent the last 18 hours learning more about who I really am than I learned in 21 years of living with you." "Isla, sweetheart," stop calling me that. The words came out harder than I'd intended, causing Rosa to look up from the stove with concern. I lowered my voice again. "My name is Isabel Carmen Martinez. It was given to me by people who loved me before you decided I needed to be someone else." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if Margaret had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "We gave you everything. We gave you opportunities, education, a stable home. We loved you like our own daughter." "No," I said, watching Rosa pour coffee into a mug that said "World's Best Grandma," a gift, she'd told me, from Miguel's children who'd never forgotten about their missing cousin. "You loved the idea of me. You loved having a daughter who made you feel generous and good about yourselves. But you never loved me enough to let me know who I actually was." "That's not true." "Then prove it," I echoed the challenge I'd given Harold the night before. "Come to Toledo. Meet Rosa. Look at the shrine she's kept for me for 25 years and tell me you were protecting me from someone who didn't love me." Another pause. "Harold and I will drive down this afternoon." After I hung up, Rosa set a plate of eggs and fresh tortillas in front of me and sat down with her own breakfast. For a few minutes, we ate in comfortable silence, the kind of easy companionship that felt both new and familiar. "They're coming here," I said finally. Rosa nodded. I heard, "Are you ready for that?" It was a good question. Part of me wanted to avoid the confrontation entirely, to simply disappear into this new life I'd discovered and pretend the Pembertons never existed. But I was beginning to understand that avoiding difficult conversations was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. "I think I need to hear what they have to say. Not because I think it will change anything, but because I need to understand how they justified what they did." Rosa reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were calloused from decades of hard work, but her touch was gentle. "Whatever happens today, mija, I want you to know something. Your mother and I, we never blamed you for what happened. We knew you were a baby, that you had no choice in any of this. We never wanted you to feel guilty for living the life you were given." The words hit me in a place I hadn't even realized was wounded. For years, I'd carried a vague sense of disloyalty whenever I had wondered about my birth family. The Pembertons had been so good at making me feel grateful for their rescue that I'd internalized the idea that wanting more than what they had provided was somehow selfish. "I used to feel guilty for being curious about you," I admitted. Like wanting to know where I came from meant I was ungrateful for what they had provided. "That was never about you, Isabel. That was about their fear." Rosa squeezed my hand. "People who are secure in their love don't need to make others feel guilty for having questions." The insight hit me like lightning. All those years of being reminded to be grateful, of having my questions dismissed or redirected, of being made to feel like my curiosity about my origins was somehow disloyal, it hadn't been about protecting me. It had been about protecting the Pembertons from their own insecurities. They'd never been confident that their love was enough to keep me. They'd been terrified that if I knew the truth about Rosa's 25-year search, I would choose my biological family over them. So they'd constructed an elaborate fiction designed to make sure I never had that choice.
We spent the morning looking through more family photos and talking about my mother. Rosa showed me Carmen's old room, which she'd kept exactly as it was the day my mother died. The walls were covered with nursing school certificates, photos of friends, and a bulletin board full of ultrasound pictures and notes about her pregnancy with me. "She used to talk to you all the time when you were in her belly," Rosa said, running her fingers over a journal Carmen had kept during her pregnancy. "She would tell you about the family you were going to meet, about how much we all loved you already." I opened the journal to a random page and found an entry dated just 2 months before I was born. "Isabel is so active today. I think she's going to be a dancer or maybe a soccer player. She kicks so hard sometimes that it takes my breath away." I told her about Rosa today, about how her abuela is already buying little outfits and toys. I told her about Miguel and Carlos, about all the cousins she's going to have to play with. I can't wait for her to meet everyone. I can't wait for her to see how much love is waiting for her. The entry was followed by a detailed family tree Carmen had drawn, with little hearts next to each name and notes about what each family member was looking forward to sharing with the new baby. It was the roadmap to a life I'd never gotten to live, relationships I'd never gotten to build. By the time the Pembertons arrived that afternoon, I felt like I'd lived several lifetimes in the span of 24 hours. I watched from Rosa's front window as Harold's silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway, so obviously out of place in this working-class neighborhood that it might as well have had a sign reading, "We don't belong here." Margaret got out of the passenger seat looking like she was bracing herself for battle. She wore a tailored suit and pearls, her armor of respectability, but I could see the uncertainty in her posture. Harold looked older than I remembered, his usually confident bearing replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Rosa answered the door with the dignity of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for 25 years. She was polite, but not warm, offering them coffee they declined and gesturing toward the living room where I was waiting. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's eyes went immediately to the shrine in the corner, taking in the bronzed baby shoes, the school photos, the candles that had been lit in my honor for 2.5 decades. I watched her face crumple as she realized what she was looking at. "This is what you are protecting me from," I said quietly. "This is the family you said abandoned me." Harold cleared his throat, but no words came out. He was staring at a photo on Rosa's mantle, a picture of me at age 2, taken during one of Rosa's supervised visits before the adoption was finalized. In the photo, I was laughing while Rosa pushed me on a swing, both of us radiating pure joy. "We didn't know," Margaret said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't want to know," Rosa said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "When I wrote to you 5 years ago, when I sent you proof of who I was and documentation of my relationship to Isabel, you could have found out then. You could have seen what kind of person I am, what kind of life I've built, but you chose not to." "We were protecting her," Harold said, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. "From what?" Rosa's voice was steady, but I could hear the pain underneath. "From knowing that her mother loved her? From learning that she comes from people who work hard and take care of each other? From understanding that she was never abandoned, just lost?" Margaret was crying now, but they weren't the manipulative tears I'd seen her use to end uncomfortable conversations. These were the tears of someone finally confronting the magnitude of what they'd done. "We thought," she started, then stopped. "We were told that open adoptions were confusing for children, that it was better for everyone if there was a clean break." "By who?" I asked. "Who told you that?" The look that passed between Margaret and Harold was answer enough. No one had told them that. They'd convinced themselves because it was easier than dealing with the complexity of shared love, extended family, the messy reality that children can belong to more than one family at the same time. "You were afraid," I said, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "You were afraid that if I knew Rosa loved me, I wouldn't need you anymore." Margaret's sob confirmed what I'd already figured out. For 25 years, the Pembertons had been operating from a scarcity mindset, believing that love was a finite resource that had to be hoarded and protected. They never understood that love multiplies when it's shared, that I could have loved them and Rosa and my entire extended Martinez family without diminishing any of those relationships. They'd stolen 25 years from all of us because they'd been too insecure to share. But sitting in Rosa's living room, surrounded by evidence of a love that had endured decades of separation and uncertainty, I finally understood something that changed everything.
I didn't have to choose anymore. I didn't have to pick between the family that raised me and the family I was born into. The only choice I had to make was whether to spend the rest of my life trying to repair the damage the Pembertons had caused, or to focus on building the relationships that had been waiting for me all along. And for the first time since this journey began, I knew exactly what I wanted to do.
The silence in Rosa's living room stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Margaret and Harold sat on the edge of the couch like they were afraid to fully settle in, while Rosa maintained her quiet dignity in her worn armchair. I stood by the window, watching neighbors go about their Saturday afternoon routines, and felt the weight of 25 years of deception finally lifting from my shoulders. "I have something to say," I announced, turning back to face the three adults who had shaped my life in such different ways. "And I need all of you to listen without interrupting." Margaret started to speak, but Harold placed a gentle hand on her arm. For once, they seemed to understand that this moment belonged to me. "For my entire life, I felt like I was living someone else's story," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I've been grateful when I was told to be grateful, quiet when questioning might be uncomfortable, and small when taking up space might inconvenience someone else. But I'm done with that version of myself." I looked directly at Margaret and Harold. "You didn't rescue me from abandonment. You participated in creating it. You took a child away from a grandmother who loved her desperately, and then you spent 25 years convincing that child she should be thankful for the separation." Margaret's face crumpled, but I continued before she could respond. "But here's what I've realized over the past 2 days. Your actions say more about your character than they do about mine. Your need to be seen as saviors, your inability to share love, your decision to build our relationship on lies. That's not my fault, and it's not my responsibility to fix." I turned to Rosa, whose dark eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Abuela," I said, using the Spanish word that felt right in my mouth for the first time in 25 years. "I can't get back the years we lost. I can't give you the granddaughter who should have been at your Christmas tables and birthday parties. But I can give you the woman she became, and I can promise you that I'll never disappear from your life again." Rosa smiled through her tears and nodded. "And as for all of you," I said, addressing the room but really speaking to myself, "I'm not choosing between families anymore. I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing to be Isabel Carmen Martinez Ford. All of those names, all of that history, all of those pieces that make me whole." Harold cleared his throat. "Isla? Isabel? What does that mean for us? For our relationship?" It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I looked at this man who had taught me to ride a bike, helped me with algebra homework, and walked me to my first day of kindergarten. Despite everything that had happened, those memories were real. The problem wasn't that they'd never loved me. It was that their love had come with conditions I could no longer accept. "It means that if you want to be part of my life going forward, you need to earn that place. Not by reminding me of what you've given me, but by showing me that you understand what you took away." Margaret finally found her voice. "What would that look like?" "It would look like you getting to know Rosa. It would look like you acknowledging that you made decisions based on fear rather than what was best for me. It would look like you understanding that my connection to my birth family isn't a rejection of you, it's a completion of me." The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd ever had with the Pembertons. For the first time in my life, I wasn't performing gratitude or managing their emotions. I was simply stating my truth and letting them decide how to respond. Harold apologized. Not the careful, qualified apology I might have expected, but a genuine acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. Margaret struggled more. her need to justify their actions warring with her growing understanding of how much damage those actions had done. But when Rosa quietly showed her the box of unsent birthday cards and Christmas presents she'd accumulated over the years, something fundamental shifted in Margaret's expression. "I thought I was protecting her from instability," Margaret whispered, holding a hand-knit sweater Rosa had made for my 10th birthday. "I thought we were giving her a better life." "You gave her a different life," Rosa replied gently, "but you also took away her choice to know where she came from, and you took away my choice to love my granddaughter." By the time the Pembertons left that evening, we hadn't solved everything. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and boundaries to establish. But for the first time, we'd had an honest conversation about the foundation our relationship had been built on. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of discovery and connection. I extended my vacation in Toledo, using my saved vacation time from my part-time job to immerse myself in the life I'd never known. Rosa introduced me to extended family members, longtime neighbors who remembered my mother, and family friends who'd been wondering about Carmen's daughter for decades. I met Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been my mother's best friend and still worked at Mercy Hospital. She showed me the pediatric ward where Carmen had planned to work after graduation and told me stories about my mother's dreams for our future together. I spent afternoons with my Uncle Miguel, learning to make his famous tamales and hearing stories about the mischief he and Carmen had gotten into as children. His wife Sophia showed me photo albums from family gatherings I'd missed, and their children, my cousins, welcomed me with the easy acceptance of people who'd always known I belonged. Carlos, my younger uncle, took me to my mother's grave for the first time. The headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Daughter and Mother." Someone had left fresh flowers. Rosa, I realized, who'd been visiting regularly for 24 years.
"I used to come here and tell her about my kids, about work, about everyday stuff," Carlos said as we stood in the autumn sunlight. "But I always ended up talking about you, wondering where you were, hoping you were happy, asking her to somehow let you know that we never forgot about you." Standing at my mother's grave, I felt a sense of completion I'd never experienced before. Not because my search was over, but because I finally understood the full scope of my story. I was the daughter of Carmen Martinez, a young woman who'd loved me fiercely in the short time we'd had together. I was the granddaughter of Rosa Martinez, who'd spent 25 years holding space for my return. I was the niece, cousin, and family member who'd never been forgotten, just temporarily lost. But I was also the daughter of Margaret and Harold Pemberton, who'd loved me imperfectly but genuinely, who'd given me opportunities and education and a different kind of stability. Their love hadn't been worthless just because it had been built on flawed foundations. A month after that confrontation in Rosa's living room, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I applied for a transfer to the University of Toledo's social work program, found an apartment 10 minutes from Rosa's house, and began the process of building a life that honored all the parts of who I was. The Pembertons struggled with my decision initially. Margaret, in particular, seemed to interpret my move to Toledo as a rejection of everything they'd given me. But as weeks turned to months and as they began to develop their own relationship with Rosa, they started to understand that my choice wasn't about choosing one family over another. It was about choosing wholeness over fragmentation. 6 months later, I graduated with my social work degree and took a job with the same agency that had handled my adoption. My specialty became post-adoption services, helping other adult adoptees navigate the complex emotions and relationships that come with reunion. I used my story, both the pain and the healing, to help other people find their way back to themselves. Rosa and I developed our own rhythms and traditions. Sunday dinners became sacred time, often including various family members and sometimes the Pembertons, who gradually learned to be part of our extended family rather than my only family. We celebrated my birthday twice, once on the actual date, with the elaborate parties Margaret still insisted on throwing, and once on the anniversary of my return to Toledo, with Rosa's homemade cake and
quiet storytelling. The shrine in Rosa's corner eventually came down, replaced by current photos of family gatherings and everyday moments. But she kept the candle, lighting it every year on the anniversary of my mother's death, for Carmen, so she knows her daughter came home. I never legally changed my name, but I started going by Isabel Carmen in my professional life and with my Martinez family. The Pembertons eventually learned to use it too, though it took Margaret longer than Harold to adjust. I hyphenated my last name when I got married 2 years later, becoming Isabel Carmen Martinez Thompson when I married David's replacement, a kind, funny social worker named Alex, who understood that loving me meant loving all the complicated pieces of my history. The wedding was held in Rosa's backyard, with both families present and contributing their own traditions to the celebration. Margaret helped me choose my dress, while Rosa's sisters prepared traditional foods for the reception. Harold walked me down the aisle, but Rosa was the one who performed the traditional blessing, welcoming Alex into our extended family with the same warmth she'd shown me when I'd appeared on her doorstep that October afternoon. Today, 5 years after that life-changing birthday confrontation, I understand that healing isn't about erasing the past or choosing sides in old conflicts. It's about integration, taking all the pieces of your story, even the painful ones, and weaving them into something whole and authentic. The little girl who was separated from her grandmother grew up to become a woman who helps other families navigate reunion and relationships. The adoptee who spent 21 years feeling grateful for scraps of belonging became an advocate for transparency and adoption. The daughter who was taught to be small became a person who takes up exactly as much space as she needs. I still have hard days, moments when the weight of all those lost years feels overwhelming, times when I wonder who I might have been if I'd grown up knowing my full story from the beginning. But I also have Rosa's Sunday dinners, my cousin's children calling me Tia Isabel, and the deep satisfaction of work that helps other people find their way home. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm putting my own daughter to sleep, Carmen Rose Martinez Thompson, named for the grandmother she'll never meet but whose story she'll always know, I think about the 21-year-old woman who sat in that Cleveland diner, terrified and angry and desperate for truth. I wish I could tell her that the pain was worth it, that the confrontation was necessary, that choosing herself was the bravest thing she'd ever do. I wish I could tell her that family isn't about blood or adoption papers or who raised you. It's about who shows up, who stays, and who loves you enough to let you be completely yourself. But mostly, I wish I could tell her what Rosa told me that first morning in her kitchen. Mija, you were never lost. You were just taking the long way home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.